Here we go. Okay. Welcome, Dr. Sandy Shullman.
Thank you.
This is April 29th, 2015. I'm Kathleen Ashton, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Sandy Shullman. Dr. Shullman is currently the managing partner of the Columbus, Ohio office of the Executive Development Group, an international leadership development and consulting firm with offices in North Carolina, Atlanta, and Ohio, and London. In this role, she directs large-scale executive coaching, executive education, and development projects for national and multinational client organizations. Sandy has degrees from Dickinson College, Harvard University, and a PhD in counseling psychology with an organizational emphasis from The Ohio State University. She was awarded a fellowship at the Center for Creative Leadership and was a Catherine Sisson Phillips Fellow of the National Association for Women Deans, Administrators, and Counselors. Sandy has been active in the American Psychological Association and is a current member of the Board of Directors. She also chaired the Good Governance Project and is a member of the Executive Committee of the Leadership Institute for Women in Psychology. Welcome, Sandy.
Thank you.
So Sandy, to get started today, tell me a little bit about how you first got interested in psychology.
Well, it's not a straight journey into that. My undergraduate background is in mathematics and logic, and I did some what would I think be classified in my undergraduate college as student development work. It was a small undergraduate college. I had the opportunity to work very closely with the dean of students there, and I also had an opportunity to work with the provost very closely as the first student representative on the governing board of our college. And so in the process of that, I got very interested in human systems. I had been studying logic systems and mathematical systems and systems in physics. But the human pieces were, I really enjoyed working with people, and I was kind of looking at it from a people systems perspective. So I decided very late in my undergraduate career that I'd really rather go to graduate school in psychology, having already applied and been accepted in a number of programs for PhD in mathematics. That was quite a shift all of a sudden. But with the help of the provost of my undergraduate college, I was able to switch gears in a very short period of time and pursue and have consistently in my career had this really passionate interest in how people systems can work effectively. So that's where I kind of got into psychology.
Okay. What was it like to be a woman in psychology at that time?
All right. This would have been in the late 60s, early 70s. It was quite difficult for a number of people, and I didn't probably have the most difficult journey of all my colleagues. But on behalf of many of my colleagues at that time, it was very, very difficult. I can give you an example that's a small one, but psychologically, I think it makes the point. But in my first professional seminar, in my PhD program, I decided to present a data-based presentation on the status of women in psychology. Mm. Now, today you could call the APA and you could get the data right away. Well, no, you couldn't, because that wasn't being collected routinely. So I worked very hard to really call various offices, APA, get numbers, get some membership things, get some alumni kinds of things, look at various people in the field, and I put together what I think would have been considered a pretty up-to-date presentation at that point. And I presented it in a room full of colleagues, all of which were men, mm-hmm. and including the person running the class. And at the end of the class, the professor actually was quite supportive and found the data quite fascinating. One of my male colleagues turned and said, I hear what you're saying, and I know you have data, but I just don't believe it. And they had to lay out the case for discrimination. And so at that point in time, I quickly recognized that, the scientist practitioner approach was going to be the scientist practitioner, let's change the believer approach kind of thing. And that was difficult. And so those attitudes really prevailed at that time. It was a very, at that time, very male-dominated field. Faculty predominantly male, very Caucasian-based as well. And so a whole notion of having a different perspective on things, it was a fairly restrictive way of looking at the world, a worldview. And so it was difficult. And some of my colleagues really psychologically struggled because they were having a lot of failure experience. At that point in time, I was fortunate enough to have had some other career and job experiences and some other things in my background that I think made me a little bit more resilient, but it still didn't hurt any less. It just was that I could do something with that. It was very painful. Mm-hmm. We really weren't full invitees at that point in time. Mm-hmm. So,
what has it been like to watch the change with women becoming more prominent in psychology over the years?
Well, it's been exciting because right around that same time that I came in to my PhD program, there were a number of women that were just a few years ahead of me that were they were established, kind of mid-career kind of women, were really taking some risks in psychology nationally, and some of them lived here locally, and they really took some risks to make some statements at the national level about the status of women in psychology. And from that time forward, I always felt, since some of those people were people that mentored me or people that I admired, I followed the same course and felt they were paying it forward, and I felt that we had the same obligation to do the same thing. So there's been a cohort of us that all graduated at about the same time, had the same kind of passion about improving the status of women in psychology and in general in the society. So there have been colleagues now that we have worked on these issues together, both at the OPA level and nationally, for probably close to 40 years. It would be at this point. So, and that's been exciting. It's been a lifelong passion, and we are, we're starting to see the real progress that has been made, even though there are still more inequities in the field than people realize right now. And I think there'll be data coming out probably in the next year ago. So again, that will probably show where those inequities still are. But the passion that we have to see women thriving and see many more women being deans, chairs, running healthcare practices, healthcare organizations, journal editorships, being presidents of APA, we worked on that. It's very gratifying, very, very gratifying.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you for the work that you've done on behalf of women in Ohio and psychology.
We appreciate all the support we've gotten on that too. It has been a journey of real love for a lot of us for a long time.
What more do you think women need to do in psychology to move forward in leadership now? What do you think are the current issues facing women in psychology?
Well, I think targeting some of the key leadership areas in psychology. My understanding is, and I don't have all the data in front of me right now, but I think some of the trends in the data would say that the gaps between, for example, men's and women's salaries in certain targeted areas, our relative percentage gaps are actually bigger now than some of the other STEM sciences. Mm-hmm. That we have actually relatively lost some ground over the past few years. So that says something about women in psychology seeing themselves in very vital roles and then negotiating in ways to be paid what their equal worth is for doing these important leadership roles. So we have to see ourselves as leaders, be prepared to be leaders, and be prepared to be remunerated as leaders, again, to set a precedent that will help other women.
Okay, thank you. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about how you became involved in the Ohio Psychological Association.
That's a good question. Actually, I became involved in OPA I was invited to be a member of a focus group. John Corrigan, who was working, I forget what his role was, whether he was president-elect or head of strategic planning or whatever, was coming up with a strategic plan for the 90s for the Ohio Psych Association. And he formed he did this in his usual very comprehensive and professional way, and I had known John in graduate school, but I was invited to be part of a focus group about OPA, giving impressions from people that weren't centrally involved in OPA about things they could be doing. And in this focus group, as you could probably imagine, I expressed some concerns about things that I thought were missing in the situation, not being short for words. And one of the things that I felt that wasn't happening, this would have been in the late 80s, like 1988, 1989 maybe, is that I said I don't see OPA investing in public interest issues or it's what we would say in psychology are public interest populations. Diversity, public interest policy issues, that it felt very almost solely guild-oriented, and my feeling was that what's good for the public is good for psychology, and I still believe that to this day, and that OPA could expand its efforts more to diversify itself and work more directly for issues related to the public. So I said all that in the focus group and wrote that in my questionnaire and everything, and you go away from these things, but John, the great leader that he is and was, came back to me and said, we'd like to start a public interest effort at OPA. Would you be interested in coming and joining us? And so even now, OPA has a very different meaning to the term public interest committee, which is people that work in public institutions. But its original origins were to get at diversity and public interest. And so that was my first role at OPA, was to try to bring more of a sense of diversity and a diverse worldview and some other people who hadn't been represented at OPA to the table. And that's what I did for the first few years at OPA, and it's been another one of my long-standing career abiding interest in multicultural and diverse issues around diversity, and that so that he tapped that in me and helped me bring that to OPA. So that was where it started.
That's where it started. And then you were OPA president from 1992 to 1993.
Yes, I think that's right. Absolutely. I went through, I'm sure, a couple rotations of committee chairs. I know I did public interest. There may have been several other things I did that I can't remember at this point, to be very honest. But I've been kind of a utility infielder for OPA. I've done a number of roles over the years, probably not the order you need to do them, but I was a president in 1992 to 1993, which was at that time also during the transition period when we had a very long-standing executive director, and we were in the process of transitioning from an interim director. We had an interim director, and then we had now, once again, a long-standing executive director. So it was an interesting period of transition for OPA in general during my presidency.
Okay. Were there any transitions in governance at that time in OPA? I remember there was a transition at one point with the size of the board.
Yes, that came a little bit later, I believe. And it started us thinking, there was a group of us, and this went over a period of 3 or 4 years. There were a whole group of us that thought about those things and worked. When I was president of OPA, my recollection is that our board meetings were decision-making meetings of a group of 52 people. And if you know much about group process, when someone says, well, let's have consensus with 52 people, that makes it's a little tough sometimes just to manage the room long last, to have, intimate, thoroughly vetted kinds of discussions where everybody can participate. So we felt at that point in time we knew for a while there that we really needed to make some changes, and that was during the period. So
what were some other memorable issues going on while you were president of OPA?
Well, when you asked me that, or told me initially that you might ask about those things, I'm thinking, what was memorable? And then right when it hit, right then it hit me, and it's very ironic that you would ask me that question today. Somewhere in the 1992-1993, a very repressive measure against LGBT people was passed in the state of Colorado, and they were the Colorado Psych Association was floored and desperately trying to go back to its legislature and try to reverse that, where the proceedings were going. And they wrote to all of the state psychological associations in the country, and they asked for support. And so we had a very robust debate about a couple of things. One, the issue itself, which was there was not unanimity on our board about the rights of LGBT people at that time. And there was also the debate, which always has run through all parts of psychology, about making sure that political stances or social public interest issue stances were based on evidence and science. So it was a very interesting process, and the result of the whole thing was that we took a stand with the state of Colorado, and we're one of the early endorsers of that, and then they got a lot of other signatories. And so it's ironic that, you know, the day after this case, potentially the deciding case coming before the Supreme Court, right after that we go back and think about what happened 22 or 23 years ago.
Yeah, it's really a momentous.
It is. It really is. Yeah. So that was one of the things. I think the other pieces during that time were some leadership transition issues. We were trying to figure out how to best organize ourselves following the transition from a longtime executive director who had been, you know, an outstanding kind of one person for many years, and then we were trying to expand the organization from a staff perspective. That was really what the transition period was about, was moving to a little bit more of a staff-focused model than just a one-person shop and as a staff and, you know, a whole volunteer group. That was the big transition. So we had a lot of issues related to that we had to address as well.
Okay. So, you know, this is a question. You train people in leadership development, but I'm interested in knowing, what did you learn about being a leader yourself while you were president of OPA?
Well, and learning is an interesting point about this. I think one of the biggest things I learned about leadership during that period of time is that I've said this many times in my life, but when you have to live it, it's very different. Your values are only hypothetical constructs until you have to lead. And so there were a number of decisions we had to make, whether it was around public interest issues that we were talking about, whether it was about organizing things or making personnel decisions related to values-based issues or conflicting issues, that really learning sometimes that doing the right thing, getting the right thing implemented so that people could agree to go with you on that, and making things happen and making them happen in an ethical and in a way with integrity is not always going to make you popular, and it really then you have to put together all of these values about you want to be collaborative, you want to be helpful, you want to do the right thing, you want to be supportive, you want to do those things, and knowing how to do that and kind of maintain yourself it's a lesson of experience at that point. I think I had many of those thoughts. I think that was one of the periods of time where I had to really, learn to walk my talk. So
I appreciate that. In looking at OPA, we know that, many Ohio psychologists, and OPA itself has played a role in national psychology as well. And you have some national roles in the American Psychological Association. Can you say a little bit about how you see Ohio psychology has influenced national psychology?
Yeah, well, I'm sure there are other people that can speak to much of this as well, but my feelings about that, I was probably in a transition generation from the generation before me who had played a very, very substantial role in national psychology. Ohio leaders in psychology were some of the people who really pushed APA to really look very strongly at how it was supporting the practice of psychology in particular. So we had former leaders like Jack Wiggins and Ron Fox, who became presidents of APA, who had been leaders in the governance process. Many of those people, and our former long-term executive director, Henry Saman, had been leaders in national psychology and trying to strengthen state psychological associations and strengthening institutions of practice, the establishment of Right State's program and some of the PsyD efforts and all of those things. We had a tremendous legacy of people at the national level, and I'm sure I'm escaping with many other people that were Sandy McPherson and some of those other folks, that Gary Danelsky, some of those other men and women who really played a key role in trying to move the profession of psychology along during the years when licensing laws were being established, when we were trying to define ourselves as a practice, as a profession, etc. So I think that's a big contribution. Then, as we transitioned through a period of transition, and under our current executive director Michael Ranney and the staff that we have at OPA, which is outstanding, we had some rebuilding to do. That transition of leadership period was a difficult period for the association, as many transitions are, and it has built over time. And I think it's hard to recognize sometimes. Ohio really has been a leader in many ways at the national level in psychology in the most recent years in a much more quiet, methodical, implementing way rather than in a major demonstrative kind of way. We do things kind of iteratively, one step at a time, making things happen. We don't do a lot of large-scale things or high-risk things or high-visibility things. But if you look at what's happened to Ohio psychology over time, we have been repeatedly recognized as the outstanding psych association in the nation. We still may be the only state psych association that's had that distinction. We've been recognized for our work in diversity. We've been recognized in many other leadership domains. And so you will see Ohio people, not just OPA people even at times, but other Ohio people. We have the Archives of Psychology in Ohio. We have lots of people that are doing great work at our various institutions, like the Cleveland Clinic, like the healthcare institutions in various parts of the state, doing leading things nationally. So you have a lot of top researchers that have come from Ohio. So we've been quietly leading, and our executive director currently is considered one of the deans of executive directors across the country. So when Ohio brings things to APA and APA brings things to Ohio, things move, and that's again due to very dedicated colleagues and the staff of the OPA. We have a reputation as being one of the strongest psychological associations, territorial associations in the country. Mm-hmm. So,
and you continue to stay involved in OPA even as you have many other commitments. Do you have any favorite stories from your many years in OPA? Any stories that stick out for you?
From OPA. Well, that's a good question. That really stick out. I have to there are some things that stick out that will probably just stay in the back of my mind, but some of the things that I think the things that stick out, and it's kind of related to the previous question, when I see people like Kathy McDaniels Wilson taking prominent leadership roles in APA, I know we have made a contribution. So that's some of my favorite stories are watching, hopefully helping to promote my colleagues to become more active in APA and national things. So those are times when we have worked together at national events as a local group to try to get some things done on behalf of Ohio and our colleagues. I think those are things when I've really been there to kind of acknowledge the accomplishments of those have been some of my, I think, favorite times. And then obviously when we've been through some key legislative victories. Those are always exciting when we finally have an impact on a legislature. We worked on parity in Ohio for years, and when we finally made progress on that. There certainly was hospital privileges. So various pieces of legislation. That was always a time when we got really excited and recognized that if you take the longer view that our hard work pays off, and then seeing the organization continue to grow and prosper, for me, are some of my favorite moments. They really are. And why I keep coming back is the organization has great leaders. The legacy of leaders, I think, that we've left to the pipeline that we have of the leaders like yourself, for example, that to me, those are some of my favorite moments, without question, is watching us continue to grow and change and learn and not become stagnant or stuck.
So, speaking of leaders, your partner, Peg, is our current president of
Yes.
the Ohio Psychological Association. And as far as I know, you're the only couple to both been presidents of OPA. And I wondered if you wanted to comment on that at all.
I think it's terrific. I mean, we did it 22 years apart. Is that about right? 22, 23 years apart. So you might look at it and say I was probably one of the relatively earlier members of my cohort or generation to be a president of OPA, and my guess is she's probably going to be one of the last members or cohorts of our generation to do that. It's been a lot of fun for me. For example, I'm currently on the APA board of directors. And we often have board meetings on the same weekends, actually. I'm in Washington, she's in Columbus. And when I ask how the meeting went or what the issues were, it's really fascinating to watch the parallel challenges that we have, the parallel things that we're learning and dealing with. And it's just been a thrill for me to be able to really support her and watch her just be, from my perspective, a little biased, of course, a terrific leader for OPA at a really significant time. So for me, it's been a thrill. It's really been a thrill.
Can you say anything else about the parallels between processes at OPA and APA having that unique perspective?
Yeah, I can. I think one of the things that you see after a while when you work nationally and having worked locally, you begin to see what, for lack of a better term, may be in the DNA of psychology and psychologists as a group. Now, there may be generalizations in there, so you don't want to be very careful about that. But, the DNA in psychology is that we are very careful to not make precipitous decisions, and probably, if anything, tend to err on the side of taking too long to decide. We really don't want to make mistakes, and that's great, but you can't always have 100% certainty when you're trying to make decisions and lead, and you can see that in both groups. The other thing you can see in both groups is the talent that there is in psychology, not just in Ohio, but at a national level. You can see that, and that's a pretty amazing thing. The other thing that you can kind of see is potentially where some of the future might be in psychology. When you talk with graduate students here in Ohio, we have that's another place we've had some national recognition, is certainly for our student group, our OPAGS group. And our early career folks are terrific as well. You can really see that many of them are doing the kind of things that, are and experiencing the kind of challenges that we have at the national level. I mean, Ohio in the national political world is a bellwether for the U.S. presidential elections. I think Ohio is as good a bellwether for psychology as it is for those U.S. national elections. I think that's probably what you can tell from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. What is some of the advice that you'd like to give to future Ohio psychologists?
Probably one piece of advice is do everything you can to keep looking outside of the organization and really looking at what's going on in Ohio. Try to stay close to the issues that are of concern to the people of Ohio and to the psychologists of Ohio. And I would probably say it's probably more important to keep asking questions about what those folks need rather than just sitting around talking to ourselves and providing answers. I think getting out there and not being afraid to try some new things, not being afraid to go out and try new roles, try a different approach, collaborate and partner with other people as we've begun to do more of in the last 5 to 10 years. those are the things that will really make us continue to make us successful, and to not forget that we don't have to come up with the answers, but we do really have to come up with really good questions, and we have to listen.
Okay, great. Is there anything else that you'd like to share just about, again, maybe even just how your personal growth has been affected by your leadership in OPA and APA?
Well, I have found that I had a background in my growing up of doing a lot of team sports, and that's one of the models for me of, I believe leadership is a team endeavor. And maybe it's not a sport, but it's certainly a team effort and a team endeavor. And I think there have been just real opportunities from my perspective to learn how to do that team endeavor for things that really count more than in sports where it's just a game. When the real things in life, for learning to use collaborative and collective talents for things that are bigger than we are. To me, that's been a big part of personal growth. The whole issue of developing as a woman leader and learning how to be a mentor and a developer of other women leaders. You know, the opportunities we have. I'm now chairing the Leadership Institute for Women in Psychology at APA, and the opportunity to work with the women I do in that institute, both the participants in the institute, the faculty, the executive group. I mean, these are many of the outstanding women in psychology. Being able to do that at the OPA level, really dealing with really fine psychologists and leaders who have really contributed to the quality of life in Ohio, to OPA, to other psychologists. You know, I can't put a price on that. That's we're in a field where we do a lot of things either behind closed doors or as solo endeavor. And I think in terms of personal development, the opportunity to continue to work on collaborative things with other people for things that are bigger than we are, to me, and learning how to do that better is probably the biggest development gift I've gotten.
Okay. Anything that you'd like to close with, or anything that we've left out that you'd like to share about Ohio psychology?
Well, I have a lot of faith in the future of Ohio psychology. I think we should never underestimate our ability to pragmatically figure out how to do things even when the going gets tough. And we are in a period of transition again, I think probably both organizationally to some extent and nationally in terms of how the healthcare system is going. I have a lot of faith in our ability to be resilient, to be forward thinking, and to really keep moving in an effective and an iterative and in a good way. So I'm waiting, I'm hanging around. I really want to see how it all turns out and how everybody else kind of takes the mantle of leadership and goes with it.
Well, I think that's the perfect note to end on. And thank you, Sandy, for being part of the Oral History Project. And I really
My pleasure.
appreciated your talk today.
Thanks.